Hello and welcome. My name is Matty, and this is episode 10. And once again, I'm joined by the great Michael Tsarion. And we get to kick off the new year, the new astrological year 2026, with our first podcast. So, just a quick question to you, Michael. Why is the winter solstice so important, and how does that relate to why Christmas falls on the 25th?
Oh, well, it's one of the main reasons, actually. The 25th is the first day that the sun sort of begins to move uh, back towards the north for 3 days, starting on the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. There's 3 days and 3 nights where the sun stands still. That's what the word solstice means. Sol, stice, standing still. It was just a phenomena that they noticed. The ancient astronomers, stargazers watched their sundials, and they were very precise, of course. And some of these sundials were quite large. And they just noticed that at the two solstice points and two equinox points, something bizarre happened where the sun would not move; it would stop. In the and although to superficially it looks like day and night still happens, of course, but nevertheless they found out that the actual movement of the sun itself stands still zodiacally. And they thought this was very, very important because it inscribed a very great cross, a big giant cross in the sky. And that's where the original symbol of the cross came from, whether it's Native American Indians using the swastika or the Indians in Asia using it, and then the Christians using it. This was an astrological cross. You can see that the Celtic cross is so much, obviously, that. It even has still the circle, the Irish cross with the cross and then the circle.
St.
That's the
Bridget's.
sun. Yeah, exactly. Sun standing still on the cross. So it's astrological. So that's what it came from. And then, but generically, the 25th is when they saw the sun starting to move again. So that became the opening of the new year. And then for more convenience, they just said, well, no, we'll make it January 1st. For the public from a calendar point of view. But actually, the real opening of the year is sort of the 25th, you know,
Yeah, that's
astrologically. Yeah.
fascinating.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, we'll have to do a show just on astrotheology itself. Yeah, yeah. I think we'll need to
Yes.
do one of those. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yes. Of
Yeah.
course.
Um, but yeah, we'll sort of keep on the theme that we've been working on so far, and we're going to read one of your articles called "Individuation and the Will to Meaning," as it just so perfectly encapsulates what we've been discussing so far. So, if people are almost looking for a standalone episode, hopefully this one will help to do justice towards that. So, I'll read a little bit off the article, and then I'll pass it over to yourself, Michael, if that sounds okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Super. So again, like all articles, this can be found on michaeltessarion.com. And again, it's called Individuation and the Will to Meaning. So it starts off with a quote by Rollo May. All evolution can be described as the process of differentiation of the part from the whole, the individual from the mass, with the parts then relating to each other on a higher level. Although Carl Jung and Otto Rank started their illustrious careers as Freudians, they were never as committed as the great mentor to the theory concerning the primacy of the sex drive. Although sexuality relies on libido or energy must be thought of as the essence of more than just animalistic drives and sexual instincts. Energy is foundational and all-pervasive. No aspect of consciousness can be what it is without it. Given this fact, questions arise as to what libido is in itself. If all growth relies on it, what can be said about its apparent purpose? Even if, like Schopenhauer, we refer to it as will, we are still left to sensibly describe it. Apparently, we know more about black holes than we do about our own life force. And so I'll pass it over to you, Michael. Any comments on that so far?
Oh, well, a couple of things. Thank you. Yeah. Well, Rollo May is opening quote is interesting because it's already a summary of Hegel's theories, believe it or not. When I talk about later scholars of all types reiterating and repackaging the work of former people, this is a case in point, and they do so without citation. They leave it for you to know what's going on. You see, often Rollo May was a great man. I'm not saying that, right? But sometimes the ideas that they purvey are just a repackaging of great thought of a previous sage. And so this idea of differentiation, the words may have been slightly altered, but this idea that there is even a process at all that's unfolding in a certain way. And last time we talked about telos and how anything that man makes really doesn't have it. Man has it. He becomes, right, from an infant, from a fetus to an infant and then on. So telos is in us like it is in all natural things. But should we create something, it's pretty much dead from a telos point of view. It doesn't compare to anything in nature which has this telos. Now, this is bizarre because it means then that why would scientists who know exactly what I'm talking about be materialists? Why would they? What is the purpose of denying intelligence to that which has telos and telling you that the thing that doesn't have telos has the intelligence? We've got to be off to a wrong track right from point go. If a child is told all these things over in this side have telos, and that's explained to them what that is, right? Like we said, the seed grows into the oak tree, and then at the blossom of the oak tree with the acorn, the seed is there again to be replaced. And anything that resembles that in nature always has this teleological movement within it. But anything that man creates does not. And then I say to you, but I'm now going to deny intelligence to the part that has telos and award it to the part that doesn't. Are you going to stand by that? Is anyone in their right mind? Now, you may not know how to locate the telos in that which is natural, but you're not going to deny the natural. I mean, it's common sense to say, well, we still haven't found it yet, but I'm going to award it to the natural, not just the human, when clearly the human, anything that the human creates, is just a dead thing. Of course, I'm going to be generous enough to say that the natural, of which I myself am a part, that's how I get to be intelligent? No, I'm going to cut off. I'm just going to truncate the whole thing, draw a circle around the human and go, that's only where there is a real intelligence. How can I claim that you're intelligent to do that? Why would I want to listen to anything else you're going to say? You know, what we do. This is unspeakable, lunacy. And then the institutions, you see, hope that because they have the big stamp, they got the big boot, they've got the big award ceremonies, that you will literally do this. But the dissenter is thinking, I don't think I can do this anymore. I've jumped through their hoops, I've won some of their awards, but it leaves a bad taste. So your Ian McGilchrists and Rupert Sheldrake's, and Bruce Lipton's and others, that's why they dissent. That's why I cannot, even the Michael Cremos, they go, no, I am from that world. I've played the game of the institutions, but I'm ready to enlarge my worldview, and then that's when they are forced to go back and realize the antiquity of some of these ideas and to look into some of these other people. Now, of course, the next part that you read there has to do with the will. Well, this is the thing. When the materialists, people like Schopenhauer, looked into the origin of the will, they just thought it was a blind thing with no meaning at all. Randomly act, just exactly the same way that materialists always think of things. So when you say will to meaning, the full expression would be will toward power, will to power, will to meaning, right? It's will toward it. So we will toward power. So for the Nietzschean and for the materialist, that's what life is all about. But what I'm trying to open up with there is just a simple statement that what do you really know about this will then? If everything is about, willing toward it, willing towards power, what we know what power is. Power is the simple dynamic where you've got the power and somebody else doesn't. If everybody has the power, then it negates itself. Power must be a dynamic in which there's a master-slave relationship. And we've just enunciated one of them, man and nature. Nature is degraded. Remember in the Cartesian thing we also talked about? I create a hard subjectivity. Where did that even idea come from? Because that's another crafty backdoor way to say, well, I'm important and I'm awarding intelligence and mind to myself, but I can deny it to the natural or to the animals. See, it's all based on this thing we're talking about, but it's will toward. So that might, be something that, because when you say the word will to meaning, it kind of can confuse people. The English, we don't usually use that phrase. So just think of it as a will toward something. I'm willing myself toward. But this article is trying to open up and say, what do we even know about will? Are we in control of it? Surely, surely not. And so some perceptive philosophers like Schopenhauer said, yeah, well, maybe it's in control of us. Maybe our libido is acting with its own, dynamic, and we're just sort of carried along for the ride, like you'd be riding a wild stallion. But even if that is the case, you would still want to know where it comes from. But if you read on, we'll unpack that a little bit more, I think, if you don't mind.
Again, I find that first bit fascinating. Apparently, we know more about black holes than we do about our own life force. That's an extraordinary little
Exactly.
quote there.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
and it'll continue
that,
that way if people are
yeah,
left to their own
yeah.
devices. Nothing will change.
It's something else. So yeah, Freud made a great effort to show the effects of the will, but something about his definition seems lacking. After all, his view of life was reductive. As far as he was concerned, human experience is merely a matter of matter. It's all about the stuff of the objective world knocking up against our all too physical senses, nerves, and neurons. Mind need not apply, there's no such thing as mind. Matter affects matter, and that is all we need to know about and study. And this is a quote from J.B. Watson. No behaviorist has observed anything that he can call consciousness, sensation, imagery, perception, or will. And so, just to pass it back to you there, this seems like his thinking was steeped in this period of time of the materialism with it, which kind of is just carried on with it now. But I think we're pretty much coming at the cusp of the end of that then, essentially. Is that kind of how you see it as well? And how did his disciple, people like Carl Jung, then differ from his view of what libido is or what the physical energy is or more psychological energy, the energy of the
Yeah.
psyche? Yeah.
Well, they just weren't satisfied. As I said, some of them started to broaden the idea. And Freud himself was much more open than, some of the quotes that he had say. I must give him that. Towards the end, he was much more open to other ideas. He wasn't, let's put it this way, he wasn't completely satisfied. And he was with his own theories, and he also was open to other ideas. But being a materialist, and being a very, very skeptical kind of guy, rationalist, he wanted concrete empirical evidence. Now, the thing that Jung claims to he wanted the same thing. Jung is always telling you on every page he's an empiricist. So although Jung's work goes into different directions, Jung himself was quite loath to call himself an idealist or even a metaphysician, by the way. So this has caused a great deal of trouble. There were religious-minded people around at the time who, once they had read Jung once, they went, he's one of us. In fact, that guy's a closet monk. Who's he trying to fool? So any religious thinker of the time, some of them were very great, immediately spotted Jung and said, he's one of us. What is this joke? You see, but Jung kept fighting them, so he wanted to stay a little bit more on the agnostic side. And the materialists also thought Jung was a bit of a mystic too. So the vast majority of the public, when reading him, thought he was a mystic and thought he was certainly a metaphysician. But Jung himself kept fighting that. And I don't know what it was, whether it was his own ego, or was it a genuine point that he was trying to make? Oh, please stop identifying me with some woo-woo things. I'm not, please. So you don't know. When you read his work, it's very, very hard to say. I just look at him as a sort of a mystical naturalist, because his last book was Earth Has a Soul. And I wasn't really surprised to read it, where he comes back to this, because I had already spotted this from my own reading of him from the beginning. So by the time I get to the end and find out that he's written a book like that, it kind of didn't surprise me. There was no doubt. Now, also, the thing that you just read there, you see, he started to question this hard materialistic thing. Remember about matter knocking up against matter, that sort of Freud said, okay, we'll keep it Darwinian. Let's, we're in safe territory if we do that. Jung was totally not satisfied with that. And he talked about the psychoid realm. And you and I have touched on it before, where it's a sort of a blending together where the contrarium of the matter and the sort of the natural the matter and the mental, let's put it that way, come together and overlap. And he called that the psychoid realm. Now, this is a step that Freud didn't really take, at least not in his English translations, right? And so he believed that when you look at a thing like will, you're seeing something that is far more mysterious in its origins than just pure sexual libido. When you say sexual libido, you're just meaning something that's instinctual, that's keeping us alive, that's good for our survival, that's animalistic and one dimensional.
Like bioenergy, kind of? Is that sort of how you'd see it? And
But it is bioenergy. Yeah, you're right. And but the scientist wants to just bring it down to a materialistic, instinctual, and sexual sort of basis because that's where they think they can get the proof, right? You can probe at that, you can poke at that, you can see that most people will go, oh, yeah, okay, I feel my energy is leading in those directions. I need survival, I need to mate, I need to procreate, right? So this, to a behaviorist point of view, this all looked really kosher. But behaviorism was finally shot down, very shortly after it began. And that's where even Noam Chomsky and people come in. Thomas Zaz comes in. There's plenty of people who were able to criticize it successfully. And so it lost traction, and it came out of this Pavlovian Russian model, and it was seen to be bankrupt quite early. So even though I put J.B. Watson's quote in there, that's just, again, to show the audience what reductionism is. He's talking about that you can't observe any of these things called will or energy or consciousness and all of these things, right? But as we've said before, so what that you can't observe it? You may not be able to observe it, but now the very same people in neuroscience are saying, but you feel it. Remember in interoception, you feel it. You feel it. Consciousness is not a matter of the observation in this narrow perceptive way. Sure, man doesn't see the spectrum of light, but we know they're there. You don't observe that. You don't observe gravity or electromagnetism, but it's there, isn't it? And even machines can measure it. So J.B. Watson, bye-bye. So this was easily overturned, this ridiculous. But see, a Jung comes in and asks the question, why is it that a scientist like J.B. Watson, who's obviously highly intelligent, as was B.F. Skinner and those people, why would they even adopt that kind of theory? What's wrong with their psychology that they then utter and pronounce and subscribe to such ridiculously, patently ridiculous theories? See, so he's going to look at the psychology of the person who, from their point of view, from a psychologist's point of view, is so scared of the real, so threatened by that consciousness that isn't human, that intelligence that isn't human, that they just want to negate it, bracket it, and say, well, I'll tell you one thing that makes me sleep better at night. Only mankind has the intelligence. Boy, don't I feel better for that. See, even your Descartes would have. They're looking for the underlying psychological reason why somebody would deny qualities of intelligence to the universe at large, right? There has to be something deficient in that person's thinking, and then that's when they would look at that person, more psychologically. And that's why I myself, even though I love what the Sartres and the Zazas write when they're attacking psychology, I still personally think that psychology is very valuable for exactly the reason we're talking about right now. Because how else would you get to the bottom of some of these materialists and some of these physicalists? You can when you know that something in their psyche is aberrant. Now, they have high IQs, so they were able to get positions of authority within society because of the high IQ. But that doesn't mean that they're intelligent. Just because they have high IQs is not the same thing as intelligence. And it shows up in their behavior, in their attitudes. And the fact that they then want to become teachers and teach this to other people in the world and broadcast this nonsense, this is what Jung is fighting, you see. And he would not agree with Schopenhauer that the will was a blind, meaningless force that just had no consciousness in it and just did things in a random way. This was simply wasn't acceptable, to those deeper thinkers. But if you don't mind reading on, we'll even see something more about that.
yeah, certainly. And it sort of reminds me of I think of Carl Jung, and you think of a perfect example of somebody who's right-brained compared to these others where you're thinking of this left-brain thinking, as that we
Oh,
discussed in the previous episode as well. Also, it's another perfect dichotomy there of those two.
very good point. I forgot to mention, yes, this would exactly be that, because the left brain is in charge of that level of abstraction, where it will take a part and it will glorify that part and it will analyze it to the nth degree, but it forgets that the part was part of a whole. To look at that narrow abstract, you have to leave out the whole. And these people are experts at that. Yeah, it's a very good point. Very, very good point there.
And Jung still, the point of the right brain thinking is he still saw himself as part of the whole. And this is part of where his sort of religious philosophy, I think, came off, when you can put yourself in this larger context, if you
Right.
know what I mean. But I'll read a little bit more here of your article. All right. So this is a photograph of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and from 330 BC. He held that all things grew purposefully toward their fullest expression. All things are, as he wrote, teleological. They have a specific end encoded within their essences. Each thing's identity isn't fully realized until the end is reached. In the case of an oak tree, for example, the majestic full-grown oak was already implicit within the acorn. The process of maturation is also known as entelechy. Today, Aristotle's theory is better known as emergence. Problematically, what we know about foundational states depends not on evidence as much as projections made from where we presently stand. For example, what we think we know about the ancient past is possibly erroneous. This is because we stand where we are looking back, supposing this and that about the past. We forget that we're not there in real time finding out what we need to know. We're encouraged to make unfalsifiable statements about the past. Our present understanding won't be helped if our knowledge of the past is false. And so, how does our view of today's world and how we interpret the past is altered by our current sort of, left brain dominant society then also?
Yeah. I put that in because it's something we need to remember. And we plow in to looking at history, and we make statements, from our modern pedestal. And sometimes we do this even in terms of the ancient Greeks and what have you. But then some critics say, how the hell do you know? How do we know what those guys were really thinking? Maybe we have shined a dim light on some aspects, but even in that, there must be projection. There must be fallacy. There must be something that we are doing in our speculations. You don't have a time machine to physically go back there, and say, oh, I met somebody from that time and I've conversed with them. Nobody does. So everything about the deep past is just speculative. And thousands and thousands and thousands of scripts and books were burned. And this is even the case for the Platonic scholars and what have you, right? Very little of it actually remained. And so they would argue that there's more lost than there has been preserved. And so that all you've got, and even what was preserved, was often translated multiple times for us to be getting it. It's the same thing with the Bible. There's hundreds and hundreds of different, and in the Old Testament, it's also the same. There's literally thousands of renditions. It's actually quite remarkable. So then they're saying, don't you see the human fallacy? But the other group says, well, then, if that was the case, we'd make no speculations about the past, and we'd be left in a void. In fact, we wouldn't even be into history at all. Given what you're thinking, the level of skepticism, then we wouldn't make any conclusions. So if you have to make some conclusions, then you should make more. So we're stuck with it. But what the other critic is saying is that, well, then you have to, if you're going to do that, you've got to maybe agree that everything you know about the past is just speculation and wrong. We'd have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. What do you really know? And I'm again talking about, like 2,000 years ago, something, quite remote, like the ancient Greeks. And, this is very, very accurate. Our own printing presses weren't even made until about the 15th century. So
When could people read even?
that's right. And that was even
Yeah.
less. That's even less than 200 years old.
Yeah.
There was a
It
monopoly
ties
on
in.
learning.
It ties in perfectly with this cataclysm stuff, as we were speaking about
That's
previously, like
right.
how little we know about history. Yeah.
That's right. And things like writing, things like psychology, are even more recent than that. The whole idea of even thinking about yourself in terms of a conscious being with these levels of introspection is something that the Owen Barfields of the world and the Julian Jameses of the world are totally adamant were later. Now, they do have critics. There's people who say, no, they're wrong. And, we had a sense of I-ness a lot earlier. But is there much evidence of that? The answer is no, really isn't.
Yeah, when you're speaking about, the telos, I was thinking there about the movement of consciousness and how consciousness has a telos, going from this unconscious to conscious to self-consciousness, as you mentioned before, like the works of Schelling, which sort of, again, ties in perfectly with what you're mentioning.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. In fact, if we read on, we might get to some of that.
Yep, super. And so this is a photograph of the German idealist Friedrich Schelling, born 1775 and lived till 1854. This almost forgotten thinker prioritized freedom. He offered his philosophy of freedom as an overarching proof for the existence of God. His argument was so strong, he suffered being virtually scrubbed from the history of Western philosophy. One can positively and confidently reach out to engage with reality or recoil from it. One can bravely inquire into their natures or perpetually avoid all questions on the matter. One is always able to choose whether to be free or unfree. Of course, this matters greatly because when we observe our times, we see that most people in society don't care to question the roots of their being at all. Not a single altar or statue of freedom have they raised. In fact, they seem to do everything they can to denigrate freedom and exalt demagoguery, conformity, and enslavement. And so, just to pass it back to you, Michael, we were speaking about we have the will, and then we asked the question, what will's the will? What's underneath that? And
Yeah.
previously, we sort of came across the work of Schelling where he described freedom is what's at the essence of the will. Um, so, yeah, have you any comments there?
Oh, well, of course, he was completely right. This was a great discovery because you see, in the natural world, with telos, the telos is pre programmed and determined. The oak tree does not become a nettle or a daffodil or a dandelion, and the dandelion does not become a rose, and the fox does not one day give birth to a tiger cub. You see, each species and each thing becomes what it only is. I mean, it's a miracle. Something we don't even notice. But the human being is free to progress, and then, as these men noticed, free to regress, free to not be part of his telos. He has the freedom, and we've spoken about this in other, context about, the child leaving the archaic level, moving into freedom, the solar world, So there's an upward ascent. That's usually how it's framed. But even if you look at it as a horizontal movement of telos, it's the same thing. The human being is the only being who can be free to say, I don't want to be free. I don't want to move forward. In fact, that's what a progressive is today. I don't know why they use that word because, yeah, it's self-deception. They're really regressives, right? So,
It's a progress back to the womb.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the man today, the millennial, the hipster, these are people who are deeply regressed. But that proves my point. They just pull up the tracks and say, it's too painful to keep committing to change. And I don't like that. It's almost that the movement of telos itself is something that they are threatened by. Like having the wind in your hair. Totally, if you're in a wind tunnel, there's something about the movement forward actually becomes so deeply irritating to a person that they become pathological. We've talked about 4 neurotic types. Well, here's another one. I don't even know how you'd categorize this. It's like completely schizoid, schizophrenic, where the very movement underlying progress is actually felt to be an irritant in the modern mind. Now, of course, they don't want to run around wearing that on their T-shirt, let you know. So this is where you get all the screams for reform, all the window dressing and optics about running amok with bull horns and looking like they're caught up in a cause and using terms like progressive. That's all the window dressing, and it fools almost everybody, as these people are wanting mostly to become static, because change is something that they've long given up upon. But back to the point, this strange thing is underlying the will. So these idealists were special people and who looked into this. And not Schopenhauer, but Schelling and others discovered, many things about the will that were not first observed. One thing about the human will, which they would have negated Nietzsche, they were before him, but post-Nietzscheans forgot that the idealists had already knocked Nietzsche on the head. All these followers of Nietzsche obviously haven't read their idealists, because Schelling had already warned people that the will is not the underlying greatest thing that the Darwins and the Freuds and the Nietzsches thought. But for one simple reason. Will cannot change the past. If someone has dropped dead no matter all the will in the world, is not going to raise that person up. And it's the same thing with you, something you may do. Everyone knows this, that you have regret, because you cannot change something that's happened in the past. So right there, that's a major threat to the whole Nietzschean paradigm. And then, in terms of a future, will cannot stop death. There's nobody on this planet who can stop their own death with all the will that you can muster in the world. So these people had a much deeper insight. They said, the will is not the all-powerful root of all. And this is what then gave your Viktor Frankl's the incentive, you see, to rethink it. And that's when he came up with his will to meaning. And in the article, you talk about Frankl later on, and I always do. Because this limited Nietzschean paradigm that's so popular amongst the youth, especially now, you got a lot of websites and channels that are obsessed with Nietzsche. I have always a good laugh at that, because there's so many flaws in what they think they know, and it's just a very trending thing. It's very catchy and very Hollywood, but they don't read the more subtle ideas, and they don't question it. But freedom underlying will makes a lot of sense, and it's proven by an analysis of the human being who can be free to commit to telos and commit to that part of what it's about. In other words, to becoming, not just being, but becoming. But he can also choose to sort of put up bulwarks against that and to hide away in the corners of his room, hide away under the staircase in life, as many, many people do, and not sign on. Now, they'll do it deceptively to give the impression to other people that, oh yeah, they're still with it. But most people are not. Most people are very, very mentally and emotionally static. And the idealists looked at that and said, well, there you go. There is the abuse of freedom. But at least you can abuse it because you've got it. And we want to look into the origins of this freedom, not just the will. That only leads you so far. So when we use the word free will, they would go, yes, now we can talk, because it's true. You got the word free and you've got the word will. They go together, and then, now we can converse. So I like their work a lot better.
Yeah, I'll carry on with a little bit more of the article.
Oh, yeah.
I'll keep going. Yeah. And so we have here Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychologist, born 1905 to 1997. Very famous for his book, The Will to Meaning. He was locked in a concentration camp, as people sort of famously know, where he developed it. And so his ideas and pratique of logotherapy inspired existentialist and gestalt psychologists. It is a noteworthy fact that Frankl was visited by the philosopher Heidegger during his first visit to Vienna. Frankl personally noticed that, in concentration camps, prisoners animated by the will to power soon broke and perished under the more powerful will of the authorities, whereas those animated by the will to meaning were able to survive unspeakable hours. This brings us back to the question of individuation as defined by Jung, Newman, Hillman, and others. According to Frankl, individuation is only attained when the will to power transmutes into the will to meaning. Although we have one or two individuals embodying the will to meaning in society, we must actively encourage more people to awaken it. This calls for the transformation of our society and upgrading of our educational system. How does this start in the family, first of all, Michael? I'll start.
Well, of course, this would be, see, in the family dynamic, we've talked about the role of the superego, and but we passed by something very, very important and didn't really dwell on it that much. And that is that one of the main functions of the superego is to turn you into one of your parents or both. Otherwise, why go to the whole hassle of why would you interject their voices and their, from a very young age? Now, of course, temporally, the superego full development, say about 6 and 7, is the moment when you really leave this sort of matriarchal, the power of the mother, right? The archaic super dependence, and you move into more of an independent realm where, of course, you're going to meet with a lot of other people in society at large outside the family constellation. And that's where a lot of linguistic abilities, your knowledge about that there's a thing called death, which might have been hardly there before. It's there, but it's not as strong. You may have had a death of a grandparent or a death of a pet. But after 7 years old, the striking feeling that you too can perish, you see, is far stronger. So there's things that, and I'm talking very generally here, right? But in the previous, stages before the superego, you may have been abused as a child. So you may know a lot about death, and you may know a lot about threat, and you certainly may know a lot about the withholding of love, right? And all these negatives. You may know a lot about pain. You may know a lot about want and suffering because your parents have constantly put you into these catch-22 situations, constantly been using these techniques of the double blind, as it's known, and really, really abused you, in the sense of crushing your will and your identity. We've talked about all of that. But what how does one reconcile that with the major function of the superego, which is to embody the parent's image so that you become like them? That's what the whole thing is like underneath. How they actually are is kind of a separate thing. The first job is to make you like them so that you can be a parent yourself, right? So that you can be a human being. But the trouble is that if the parents are substandard, if they are not good people, not good human beings, then you're off to a bad start right away. You're embodying the imagos of people that are really pretty much, flunkies. They're distasteful and probably even very, very hypocritical and, for that matter, even evil. But say we don't go that far, but they're still sort of gross people. You're in trouble because without you even consciously wanting to, you are patterning yourself on them. Now, but to be more specific about it, what you're doing is you're patterning yourself on the power that they wielded. This is the concomitant of what's known as the identification with the object of your hate. It's a dynamic that I've spoken about a lot in my work. And that is that because you've been under this power dynamic, usually when I talk about it, it's about a daughter in relationship to the mother. But actually, for our purposes, it's both sexes, right? The child identifies with the awesome power of the parent that it hates. So why would you, when you say I hate something, you'd think that it's the last thing I'd want to think about, let alone identify with. That's how the conscious mind thinks of it. But no, the psychology is very important, like we've been saying all along here. You can't negate the psychology. It's fatal because some of these psychologists have discovered things that are bloody very, very important, paradoxical as they sound. Well, life is paradoxical. Does anyone ever want to work out what is really going on in this world, or they just want to, say no to psychology and that's it? Well, I'm not one of those people anymore. So back to the point. You see this big club, you see these big boots. They've been, running roughshod over your identity, sometimes majorly so, and you're crushing your will. And the parents have been molding you into something that they feel that they would like. And then you learn to fawn, right? It's called fawning because you'll be destroyed if you don't. So over the years, you do a lot of things, and observation of children proves this. They do a lot of things in order to lower the anxiety so that their parents will like them. Well, what this has all helped. The superego is helping you do this. It's developing and developing in certain ways where you will become pliable, you see, to the tyrant, so the tyrant will start to smile on you and abuse you slightly less. But all the time in your consciousness is a rage, right? A terribly suppressed rage against these affronts. Now, this is a legitimate emotion, which is why it will have a lot to do with Jung's shadow complex later on, right? Because it's legitimate. If it was not legitimate, that would be something different. But no, these are legitimate emotions, but you suppress them. Then you start hating yourself for the suppression because your conscience says you should express this hatred, but of course we can't, right? The whole dynamic of the family constellation, the whole voice of the superego prevents you. So there's already tension from suppressing legitimate emotions. Delinquent children suppress it less, but that's why they're delinquent. Other kids develop tics and weird behavior that is sort of, you can tolerate it in the family, but most family members don't like it, but they don't know where it comes from. The bad wedding and all of these other tics. But it's just something you'll accept because subconsciously the parents know what this is all about, but they don't consciously recognize it. It's a really, really, really weird dynamic that only psychologists are really interested in. So there's this burning rage. So then by the time that the superego is being fully developed, what you've done is really embody these tyrannical aspects of your parent. You become like them. And usually you've even become a lot like the worst of the parents, the one who is the most manipulative, the one whose power you sort of hated the worst. Now, we would say in a perfect world, you'd want to do the opposite. Being brought up by these horrible parents, you would want to be a person who's totally doing the antithesis. But as we've spoken about before, how do I know what not to be when I'm 4 years old? Life is already arranged that I can't know that unless I happen to have a lot of other family members around me that I can kind of get a handle. But look at the families today. Does anybody know their grandparents? It's not like Italy or Ireland, right? America certainly isn't. In those days, you got healthier people because you had loads of uncles and aunts and grandparents and neighbors around. So that if your parents were a bit flunky, you could at least identify with other people. And this thing that we're talking about, this dynamic would be there, but it would be a lot lower. And then by the time you went to school, you might be able to identify with then more positive heroes. And it would weaken and lower the level of your identification, with these tyrannical parents. But left alone and without any outside influence, which is kind of the way it is today, you're bound to identify with the object of your hate. And then this is a cause of an enormous inner tension, which is going to basically destroy your life and take you into the future into a lot of other relationships that won't work for you. You see, because what will happen is you'll start maybe to act like a parent, and wield this inhuman power. But a part of you will observe that you're doing this. It could even happen with your own children. One of the only times that you notice that you're doing this is when you yourself have children. And you notice that, my God, I'm repeating these same patterns. My dad or my mom used to do this or play these games. But now you're so caught in it that without therapy and without, some serious contemplation, you're not going to be able to change. And then you get caught into that, compulsive dynamic. This happens all the time to people and they have no idea what's going on. They can't explain it like we've just done. So you get these rotten families time after time after time falling into the same trap. And then the parent grows up to be super nice to the grandkids. They were bloody horrible to their own children. The whole thing is so horrific.
Yeah, you'd mentioned the word fawning earlier, and it reminded me of what's known as the four Fs. And so I was studying a bit of like trauma responses in the past, and so you have four ways to react to these kind of things. To say repeated traumas from say more tyrannical parents over time who are crushing your individual will and maybe embodying this will to meaning. So the four Fs are you could have fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. And you see these different types of how people react to each of those with it, exactly like with it. So you have this sort of the schizoid type, maybe he's going more into that sort of freezing phase or people shutting down. You get the people pleaser, where that fawning's come from. You have the avoidant type, whereas the flight, and then you have this sort of aggressive or people trying to overcompensate, which is clearly what the fight response is exactly with it. These things then lead to, as you mentioned, a repressed hatred. And it's that repression goes back into this, it's held in the body once more, as we spoke about. And this leads into the work of sort of like Wilhelm Reich and things, which we'll maybe do a podcast on its own on, because there's a real extraordinary genius there. Can you speak a little bit more maybe about this repressed rage then, Michael? Like, how big of an issue is this? How much rage do children really carry against their parents? Is there any good psychologists you can think of about that?
Oh, well, yeah, Melanie Klein would be the number one, person. Also Alice Miller and so on. Because any psychologist who's noticed, like R.D. Laing would be a big one uh, as well. You see, any of them that have noticed the horrific hypocrisy and how a parent can always justify their horrible action by saying it was for the good of the child. It's for your own good. Or I meant well. Or I was only trying to help. You see, the parent has all the different avenues to justify their behavior. Or I was mistreated myself, so I didn't know any other way. And all the litany of excuses. All of these psychologists who see these clients all the time, and who notice that no parent is really that guilty when they should be tremendously guilty, but they're really not, all of these things, they are aware. They're aware of the dynamic, and they've written about it, but very few people read their books. And the rage is all important. It's very substantial. It comes out in all the tics we talked about, plus the delinquency, the fight. You said there, right? The fight, flight. But the fight would definitely be that. And the trouble is that this rage not only causes a great deal of physical ailments, the bulimia, the anorexia. Very few of the people who even treat those diseases that I've just mentioned ever mention to the child that's suffering from them that this is to do with parental rage. That's how bad things are.
100%.
Yeah. They
Absolutely.
don't even tell you.
It's
Yet that's
absolutely
what it's
essential.
all about. So the hatred of the body is merely a living out of the you have internalized towards yourself the hatred that you should be legitimately expressing outwardly. But see, the whole dynamic prevents you from doing that. So hatred has to go somewhere. Anger has to go somewhere. And so what you do is you turn it within yourself. If it's not projected, it'll be interjected. And so even bad eyesight, breakouts on the skin, awkwardness, like a lot of teenager kids have this awkwardness, right? And even some of the more loathsome traits. In the end, this is what they're all about. Until one reaches teenage years and then openly can become an alcoholic or a delinquent or whatever. See, the alcoholism is to subdue the rage, but it's also to subdue your memory. It's to also bring a certain sweetness.
Numb the
Because,
feeling.
yes, it numbs the feelings. It anesthetizes them. And it brings a kind of a desperately needed sweetness into your life. But it's also the sweetness of forgetfulness. Where you can not think about it, because otherwise, the upper brain will keep on thinking about it obsessively. And since you have no wise elders to talk to about it, no one wants to know. And everybody's dealing with their own trauma. So if you talk to them, it'll trigger their trauma, and they don't want that. So everybody puts on the Prozac smile and thinks, and censors you. You'll never have this conversation with anybody. We were policing each other nonstop. But one of the biggest reasons why you can't talk about this to anybody else is because that would just awaken in them bad feelings about their parents that they've anesthetized, and so they don't want to, so it becomes a chain reaction. And our entire culture is about trying to process this anger. Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah. And it's because they're doing it to their own children, which then creates this other psychological barrier of going, in order to recognize what I did to myself, I have to realize how I'm damaging my own kids. And this is
Sure.
how this cycle continues to repeat on and on. But
It
as
does.
you were sort of saying then, so you have the child, you have maybe a tyrannical parent, you have this crushing of their will, and then the will to power sort of takes over, which then they identify with. The, that leads to them living a more inauthentic life because they're not living according to this will to meaning or listening to the conscious more. That creates this inner tension, this inner rage, all these things we've discussed. And there's different types of breaking out of how this occurs then in terms of bodily symptoms and whatnot. But then this I think is really the key of everything we've been speaking of is it's this buried rage that's coming out in all these different manifestations or yes, it's these feelings that they have, this inner hatred that then they try to numb. I think that's what leads to this sort of hatred of the body. And then this is where this philosophy of socialism or of Gnosticism, which all tie together, come from. It's a way to try to escape these emotions, to hatred off your own emotions. And so instead of seeing them as messengers of something greater or as your way out of it, that's what they're actually trying to teach you. They go, that's the source of my pain. This is why I hate myself. This is why I hate the material world. And instead of hating the parent, it's self-hatred. And then you see these other symptoms like, the cutting and the bulimia, as you mentioned, and all these other sort of sources. But yeah.
You can hate yourself, you see, for not striking back at legitimate evil. Yeah. This is the twisted logic of the superego. This is the contract we have for what we call sanity. Your conscience screams out that you should have fought back, but you were innocent and you were young and you were vulnerable and you were weak. And so you hate yourself for the weakness. Now, somebody who hates themselves for their weakness, don't you see, is going to identify subliminally with the power that the parent had. And that's why they then go on to be a bit of a bully, a bit competitive, a bit overbearing. And then when they get into relationships, they can be a bit boorish and tyrannical, you see, because inwardly they were very upset that they were so compliant to their evil parents. And so they learned to hate weakness. And so to show that they don't want to do that again, they then become quite defensive. The word is armored. And you're right. It has been pointed out by people that the armored type who shuts himself down from legitimate feeling is more likely to then hate the earth, hate bodily existence, hate pleasure, and start subscribing to these ascetic practices, which will only lead you finally, as you say, to Gnosticism and to supernaturalism and a disdain for the living and for the biophilus. Absolutely.
And it's kind of like, you know, they say to themselves, "Oh, why did I experience this as a kid? Must be because there's something wrong with me. It was because I was a bad child, and all I need to do is be more good, be more like, or listen to the demands of the superego even further." And so they double down, and so they
Yes.
double the mistake, and they end up on this sort of path of just continually getting more and more into it with it, being
This
more
is
of
the
the crowd.
fawning. The fawning type does this. And often you see, you're not the only child. What happens if the parents themselves were fawning on another child who's fawning on them? And you're observing it. You're the bad child in the family. And but you find out that the other child who just sits there and does everything that the parent wants, they get all the attention, they get all the little gifts and prizes and approval. Eventually, you're going to learn, I need to be like that. I need to go along. I'm suffering too much for being an individual. So what you'll do is you'll hate individuality and you become more conformist. You'll know that there's a thing called individuality, but as you grow up, you won't like it. You'll see it as a problem. Of course you will, because the child who wasn't an individual, who gave in to the will of the parents, has got loads and loads and loads of goodies and all this bloody approval. You see, and we were mimicking animals. Everything is based on mimicry. The whole superego is mimicry. You're embodying the parent and you're identifying with their power. And you almost have no choice. And the more constricted the constellation, the more you're likely to do that. As I said, the only way to not do that is when you have a lot of other family members around you go, they're not, don't, your mom and dad are idiots. Then you'll start thinking like that and that'll save you. Right? When you have other adults saying, don't listen to your dad, he's a drunk, he's a gambler, he's a loser, right? That's good. That's fucking great. So then you'll go, is that right? Then I need to look up for something more heroic and you'll find it. But no, the American family today, most families, they don't want you knowing other grandparents and other uncles. This has all happened for a reason. It's all called adultism. So that they can have total dominion over the ones that are already under, they already have the dominion, but they want it more. And the tyrannical family will want it even more. Just in the same way you've heard of the many, many, many case histories in true crime, where an evil husband will cut off for his wife. She'll never be allowed to see her parents or friends. You know that, right? You've heard that?
Yes, yeah,
The same
absolutely.
dynamic. Or a cult leader.
Psychopaths isolate. Yeah.
That's it. Cult leader will do. This is no different than what I'm talking about. This is all open now. People can know this in their own life stories. But that's very, very essential. If the psychopath wants to keep, the power going, they will make sure that you don't have levity or you're not able to have any objectivity at all with what's going on. And you just live in that cage.
That's this sort of atomization of society, which the architects of control are trying to engineer more. The
Right?
more, with these smaller and smaller families with it, you break them down further. You don't have these larger extended then sort of networks to help you sort of see through this sort of tyranny. But it also reminds me of what shadow work really is. When we were speaking about this rage, if you really want to try to get through it and awaken this will to meaning more, you've got to feel that rage once more. And I think you described it as the blue flame of anger, which I always really liked. That always really stuck with me. And so a lot of people think of anger and rage. These are bad or negative emotions. How do you see these, Michael? How are these more maybe tools of communication from the archetypes or wherever way you want to take it?
Oh, yeah. Well, the legitimate emotions, you see, are stored in the body. So my personal sort of journey with that is that through body work, through proper conscious body work, like rolfing, and bioenergetic work, this is how you deal with it. It's not so much that you're going to let these emotions arise in your mind. That's intellectualizing it.
Feeling it. It's
The
feeling
Arthur
it.
Yanovs and others have realized that you can't talk your way to health, in the Freudian way. Not that it doesn't help. It does help. But a really serious person is going to want to have to then, go for bioenergetic work. Yeah. And then let the body do the speaking and read up on that subject, which is when you have to get into your Alexander Lowens, and your Wilhelm Reiches. And then I took that further in my work into this movement and started taking up the connections that Jung's shadow is best seen as the body. I think this concretizes it and makes it less abstract for people. So, and it makes sense anyway, because we are so locked in the head that the thing that is unknown to us, the thing that's pushed into darkness, is the body itself and the body language and the feeling that's trapped in the nerves and in the nervous system, and in the cells and in the myofascia. So, we have a guest on who calls it somatology, the soma, the logic and the meaning of the body. And this was pioneered by George Grodak and then later by Wilhelm Reich. So I'm a big fan of their work. Reich started off as a Freudian, he started off as a communist, but he soon learned to go way beyond both of those. And it became, a genius in his own right, very misunderstood. But again, he's like one of these Velikovsky types who all his theories have been proven time and time again. But unfortunately, we live in an armored world. We don't just have armored people, we have armored cultures. So he was always somebody who was fighting the system, and his ideas still haven't really truly been absorbed by the masses. And it's causing a lot of pathology because the psychotherapy that he was more into was this kind of body work in which he believed deeply in bioenergy and orgone and how this is suppressed through life. And he broke the Freudian model down into a somatic model, where the id, the unconscious, is really the core of the body from which the libido and energy comes. Then the middle sections, which include the musculature and myofascia, and then the surface, which is the ego. So he had a very unique breakdown, not so much a model, but he brought the model more and more to the physical, to the phenomenological, almost getting rid of the model completely. And that was his great achievement.
It's I remember last time we spoke a little bit about, Gnosticism and the roots of sort of how it started, and it was a lot of use of psychedelics and things, eating mushrooms out in the middle of the deserts with it. Do you think there is a way to use psychedelics to do a kind of shadow work in a way properly where it's healthy and it's sort of, supervised or whatnot? Or do you see it as all bad psychedelics, or what's your opinion on them roughly with it?
Oh yeah, I have no time for it personally. I think it's all bad, and always have. And I've had a lot of experience, observing it with people a lot. So I have no time for it at all. If it might help in one area, it causes a lot of other pathology in another area. So you might convince yourself that it does this, but you're not seeing some other negatives that it's doing at the same time. So yeah, I don't follow the whole world's fascination with it at all, and think it can only lead to harm. Personally.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I remember seeing some studies about, I know it's becoming more of a big thing in America where they're using MDMA and therapies like that with it for, veterans with PTSD and stuff with it. But I was just curious, but you're just thinking, yeah, no, cut that off. Do it the natural way
yeah,
with it. There's no need for these external substances.
no, and not if you were doing the right type of psychology. If you're not doing the right type of psychology, then of course naturally you're going to have less good methodologies that might seem to work in the short term. This is what will happen. But see, America's brilliant for leaving out the good stuff and finding lesser good ways of dealing with things, but it's really chasing your tail. America is compulsively trained to look for anything so that they can leave the real psychology at the door. So it doesn't surprise me that they go into 101 different areas and that they over publicize it, because I already know ahead of time what they're going to do. They'll favor anything and everything except psychology. Yeah. And that's why you've got your hippie movement growing up and behaviorism and all the isms and ologies that America has thrown up and the West in general is entirely to avoid the true down to earth psychological. Just as they've done, to avoid the real philosophical. They came up with their materialism and their reductionism and their scientism. It's all the same. It's all the same forces behind it.
Yep, yep.
So I
I know
don't
what you
have any
mean.
part, I don't have any faith in it and would not never ever counsel anyone to ever do those things. Never.
Hmm. That's good. Um, I'll maybe carry on with a little bit more of the article, and we'll just sort of keep the
Oh,
flow
okay.
going with that. With it, yeah. I'll read this little bit.
No, no.
So just to continue on with a bit more of the article, it says Jung's theory stressed that teleological movement and development are the keys to existence. His great predecessor Schelling explained it is due to an august process that consciousness develops through three stages, from unconsciousness to consciousness, on to self-consciousness. It's a teleological process ordained by spirit. And then this is a quote from Erich Newman. The individualized conscious man of our era is a late man, whose structures is built on early, pre-individual human stages from which individual consciousness has only detached itself step by step. And then this is a quote by Ken Wilber. The psyche, for better or worse, is going somewhere, and that is why the process can get stuck. Why is it fraught with frustrations, arrest, fixation, stick points, log jams? If the mind weren't going somewhere, it could never get stuck, never get sick. And so is that sort of the main issue we're seeing, is we're seeing that the will is getting stuck. It is being, being regressed in childhood. People are not able to, develop further into it. How does this tie in with your book about the dragon mother and things like that, Michael, and about this
Oh,
repression of the
well,
will?
yes, because you see, this would show you that behind the will is a telos. So every scholar falls into one of two categories. They're going to believe, one school will believe, well, let's go back to Aristotle, right? Who coined the word. We have this thing called being. And when we say being, we mean what we've talked to you and I about before, about the fact that there's a miracle of the mystery of why there is something rather than nothing. And that something that exists, all of it, is being. But then Aristotle wanted to also bring up becoming, which says that all the natural things in the world, including the human, are in a sort of a teleological process of unfolding. And philosophy needs to not only study the being, which is sort of static, but it needs to then start looking into this unfolding process, which is known as entelechy or teleology. But then, and a lot of important things had to be said, but we kept it short by just saying that the being is expressed in the whatness. Oh, no, sorry. On the thatness of things, right? That something exists. And slowly that became less important as the scientific brain, and we would know that as the left brain consciousness took over, we started looking closer up to things, the whatness of them. What are they distinctly? And that sort of took us off on a tangent, right? So even in the process of becoming, we're mostly looking at that in a scientific context, a process. So we stopped looking at it more deeply as a really remarkable thing. And remember, when you look at it more deeply, you discover this concept we just talked about, that freedom is implicit along the way, because the human being can either choose to continue the process of unfolding or he can arrest it. So something must be underlying the will, and that's freedom. We talked about that, right? So, but then you get these two other groups. The first group is those who say, okay, in this process of becoming, is the will sort of being pushed from behind, so we move forward like you would be if there was a strong wind and it was pushing you in the back and sometimes you feel moved forward? Is that what it's about? And another school, some of the idealists, thought, no, we have a transcendent self that is ahead of us in time, and it is seducing us forwards, calling us forward. And that's how we move along the continuum. But then there's this, you could imagine the third group is saying, but we can't ever know for sure which one it is. And it's one of these things that you and I have talked extensively about, remember, about how the mind cannot conclude. The mind can ask the question, but it cannot provide the actual answer definitively. And we've talked about several of these in past shows, some of them very, very important, right? Like whether or not we come in with innate ideas or whether we're a blank slate. That's what you could say that was almost a huge one. Look, no, here's one we've never talked about before, which is equally, if not right, more important than that one. The mind can pose this incredible question that I've just done. Is man and his desire body and his will moved from some external force forward, pushed by something mysterious, or is he attracted by what Fichte called, the transcendent self? You can ask that question till the cows come home. Who's providing the actual definitive answer? Answer, no one. So once again, we reach the limits of consciousness. And we could even argue the limits of philosophy. A very skeptical person will go, well, we're done then. Fold up. If you tell me all of this, then what do we need philosophy for? All it's done is ask these questions, but it cannot enable us to answer it definitively. Sure, we want physical answers, otherwise the thing is useless. But then I say to you, well, then you turn to your science and you'll find out it's equally as useless. And then they do that and they go, well, you're right. We came back, we went to science and they can't answer this either. Nobody can. So what you've done is you've come up on the limit of the reason, the limit of mind. Now, what is this? Why is it constantly this way? Now, we said that in the history of philosophy, this is what caused phenomenology and existentialism to arise as philosophies to try and counter this, to say, well, since this is the case, we need a whole new way of looking at the life. And they did. And it was called looking at, the world of experience. And that was a valuable breakthrough. And in fact, you couldn't have your progressives and you couldn't have your postmoderns without that, because they've just taken that idea of the limits of the mind and they've come up with their own perverse ideas, that there's no such thing as meaning now. You see, they've taken it all in a very, very antinomian and transgressive way. They have so much disdain for the mind and so much contempt for knowledge that they went into this spiral. You see, this anti-knowledge spiral in which everything is deconstructed and there's no meaning to be found anywhere. That's their response. They just negate. So I talk about the will to meaning and the will to power in this article being degraded into even a lower form, not Viktor Frankl's higher form of will to meaning, a lower form called the will to negation. We would know it as temple culture. Yeah, that's where we are now, because that's another inevitable response to the very things we're talking about. I'm unpacking it better than anybody on the internet does. Why this modern cancel culture nonsense is abroad and why it's so popular.
This will to negation. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
these are all responses to the very limits of the mind that we're talking about, where the mind itself starts almost turning on itself, like an internal mold or decay, right? An apathetic breakdown. It cannot sit with the answer. It cannot sit with the question. You see, it keeps knocking up against the wall and saying, how dare you, how dare I not be able to crack it? So we have to pull back from the camera and realize that all our technology, what we call technology, what we call AI, for instance, all is emerging out of this dark mud of hatred of what I call mesosophy, the hatred of wisdom itself, the hatred of the mind itself, a form of autophobia, right? Because the mind has not provided all the answers we need to everything on tap. And so over time has come an antipathy to knowledge and wisdom, right? I talk about this in the book on existentials, the book that came out, last year in May 2025. Yeah. So yes, that's right. It's on Substack. So this was one of the themes of that book. And it is causing a major meltdown in terms of knowledge in itself. But this inability, it's true. If you say, are we being pushed forward? Are we being attracted from the front? Could it even be a bit of both? Or is there something else we haven't even thought about? Right? So what you get is a bunch of philosophers on one side who go, oh, well, it's obvious. It's just the will is, self-motivated. But nothing in the world is self-motivated. Everything needs an octane from somewhere else. You see? But it's because they would say that the continuum is slightly bent, slightly tilted. And so we're always moving. The telos is always moving with a momentum. Time itself is slanted. The Fichtes and the idealists, some of them say, no, there's a transcendent self. This is the proof of it. When you want proof of transcendent self, it's this. We're always looking towards tomorrow. We're always being wooed, and called forth by our transcendent self that's ahead of us temporally. And that's what keeps us growing. That's what keeps us moving. And this is an extension of our freedom. The plant, the natural thing does not have that, right? And why those things move on that continuum, nobody can ever understand. It's the natural order. But the way the natural order works for us as human beings is that we are being called forth by a higher reality, a spiritual reality. So if somebody wanted to know what idealism is, that's it. And that force is known as the Geist, or spirit, or mind. In German, it means either mind or spirit. So this was where they had settled. And then they just said that the whole of life and the whole of science is to study this movement and the stick points, just like Wilbur was saying. And sometimes there's a little bit of regression, or difficulty, then you overcome. Now, to answer your question, though, because that was the highfalutin philosophy, what's it got to do with the parents and your existence? It does manifest there because, and the teacher for this was a man called Alfred Adler. He was a Freudian who also broke away and formed his own form of psychology, which is known as individual psychology. And he seemed to know a lot about this, as all the Austrians and Germans did. They'd read widely, they knew things. And he sort of beautifully brought this down to earth. And he invented what was known as the superiority complex. Also, you can call it the inferiority complex. These are his terms. And it's slightly different. When we say the words, we have a thought about what they mean. What he meant was inferiority as it is biologically and organically, like the weakness in a child. Just your simple physical weakness and lack of intelligence. You're young, you're an infant, so you have this constitutional weakness. But one thing you have, and that is an impulse to get the hell away from anything that constitutes a unpleasurable situation. You could think of it like when there's breastfeeding. Those who observe this minutely notice that first the child learns to suck on the breast quite naturally, as normally as you would. But within a few months, the child starts to bite the nipple and the breast, to be more aggressive, and to hold on, until you get these kids who even hold on to the mother's hair. You know how you've seen those, and how they'll even hold on to the apron strings more violently, and they'll be much more whingy and crying and tantrum oriented. So the psychologist wanted to know what causes, first of all, it's sucking normally and it's passive, and then comes this moment where it's aggressively biting. What caused that? Why would it suddenly, right? So they noticed that very, very young, these tendencies start to emerge, and it does so naturally. And of course, if the mother is a mother who is impatient and says holding back the breast or holding back her attention, the child is naturally going to reach out for it more and become more aggressive. So they notice that the aggression is in the hands of the mother. The child can sense that the mother is not there, or is holding back, or doesn't want to be nurturing or provide. And so the child, like any natural animal would do, grabs more, bites more, wants more, sucks more, right? This is the origin of the aggressive instincts. But what we're doing, by the way, is completely negating feminism, just in case anybody doubted it, because they never conceded any of this, even though they're meant to be top psychologists. There's a laugh. But this is what's happening. But back to our point, the overcoming of unpleasurable uh, feelings creates a trajectory, a telos of its own. I want to get away from this, whatever it is that's negative, and get back to a homeostatic state. It would be the same thing if the door was open and you're feeling cold. You'd want to close it and go, I want to be back in the warmth. You see? So in the mother-child dynamic, it soon becomes very Adlerian very quick, in the sense that the child learns instinctively, I don't like this, and I want something different. And we would, as this matures up through the Oedipal stages, it just is this movement from a state of inferiority to a state of superiority. And when there is this transition from the inferior to the superior, there's a payoff. The overcoming succeeds, and you often get what you want. The tantrum is a method of that. In fact, all child behavior, absolutely all of it, is this movement. And this is therefore Adler's way of describing the will. Right? Yes, because you have a desire and the desire is not met. And so you discover that you have to push back at the forces that are not meeting your desire. And that force is a will, a collective will, the will of the mother, the will of the parent, the will of society, the will of teachers, the will of your siblings, right? And so you find that you have to be violent because they are violent. This is very, 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 very important what we're talking about. It's the death knell of all feminism, but it's more than that. It's even more than that. So what happens is you first learn aggressiveness, destructiveness, and violence as a reaction to that which is being violent and constrictive to you in the form of what can be loosely called the collective will. Right? And so your penchant for violence is secondary. It's not like the feminists say, innate to the man, to patriarchy, to masculinity. No. Very, very far from it. So you can imagine how sunken lies we've been all these years. Yeah, total opposite. So we have no choice but to muster our will in this Schopenhauerian way that he hated. He thought this was ghastly. But he didn't see what we're seeing because he came from a pre-psychological age. And even though he was a great thinker, he missed more than he got. It was inevitable. Yeah, he was just a bit early. The Freud got it. The Freuds and the Adlers got it. And they understood. And then Melanie Klein and the others, they massaged it out. So the child gets a payoff because it discovers that its teeny-weensy will, weak as it is, actually got some traction there. It won over that sibling, or it won over that bloody parent just by persistent force and just by this impulse to say, I'm pushing back at you, mate. You're pushing on me and I'm going to push back. If I don't, I'm one of these compliant fawners that you talked about. And those fawners are never going to achieve anything in life. And they're going to end up as drug addicts and alcoholics or taking pills by the time they're even out of their teens. The fawner will. The fawner will be loaded with hatred to themselves because of not fighting back, not pushing back. At least a willful person can say, well, you got one and I got one here. One for you, one for me. And here's two for me and one for you, right? So the willful person tends to be the ones we meet of a day. They're the ones out in the world. Not perfect, but at least they willed themselves forward. And they are trying to become the superior type. So he says that that's what we are. The winner, the man who wants to be superior, is the person who's been able to overcome all these hurdles. You see? And so he becomes a disciple of the will. So my book is called Disciples of the Mysterium, and the Mysterium is singular, and it means the will, right? Because we become disciples of the idea or disciples of the thing, right? Disciples of the will. And is that a problem? Yes, it's a problem, but it's a necessary one, because without it, we'd be crushed. So those niches who wanted to understand and address the will, I believe that this is what they were doing. And I see them as being good, but there's limits as well. You know, all the people who wrote on this, I'm trying to express it in my way, throwing in a lot of other scholars who are more sophisticated than those guys. But Adler's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And we've done on Unslaved, I've done podcasts on him. There's one called Forgotten Genius, Alfred Adler. People can watch that to get this, you know, even more nailed. So what you see then, now, of course, implied in this is an obvious difficulty. The moment that the child shows the signs of will, doesn't it awaken even more threat in the parent who's already been tyrannically trying to suppress the child's identity? What do you think happens when the child starts to show the two fingers? You see?
Crush it further. Yeah.
Crush it further. So now adultism really begins in earnest, where one or more of the tyrannical parents, or both in some cases, now go, oh, you little fucking brat, go to your room. You're being denied this and that and the other. Go to your room is like being imprisoned. So are these people? It's violence. How dare you tell somebody to go to prison and sit there until you're ready? Do you realize what that means culturally? Well, that's what you're doing to your own children when you do that, or denying them, or even throwing them out of the house. I've known parents who've actually thrown 3-year-old children out into the darkness of the night.
Not surprised. Yeah.
To walk around all night in the London streets or whatever it might be.
Hungry.
Oh yeah, lock a door, close them out in the middle of the rain, and say, "You're off. Go fuck yourself." So, and the child just walks around. So any pedophile can pick him up. Any danger can come. You know, walking through the nights. This is called parenting for you, right? And the parent justifies it. So the danger is always fraught, or even with a sibling. If one of the siblings, and it's usually the older sibling, is preferred, but not all the time. Sometimes it's the second or third sibling that gets all the love, and the older sibling has to bear the responsibility of the family. And don't forget, the older sibling, by being older, is also a caregiver to the younger. So the older sibling can sometimes get the worst, because he's no longer treated as a child. He's treated as yet another parent to the younger child. So the older sibling can feel like the pressures of the world are on his or her shoulders, and come to resent, you see, the younger sibling. But the younger sibling can also come to resent the older sibling, because he's saying, how dare you parent me? I've got 2 parents already. I don't need you. Don't tell me what to do. So the younger children always become more feral. One, because they're pampered more, they're entitled more, you see? And the older child is the one who always usually goes and gains more success in the world, because there was greater responsibility put on their shoulders. And the younger kid who got off all crime and who could do no wrong is usually the delinquent child, who goes up and grows in his teens to become more feral. They've noticed this, right? So there's all these weird dynamics to this, but we just keep it very simple. The idea is that the child is forced to overcome, and it does this via the will. And so most people are actually disciples of the will, and they're never going to let go of it, because the will did win them whatever little stripes that they have, whatever little benefits that they have. Now, the delinquent child doesn't know when to give up the will, because it got him what he wanted. In his mind, he got the freedom and the pleasure, and he got the cake, because if they didn't give him the cake, he'd steal it. And if he didn't get the money, he'd rob his mother's purse. So he gets it, right? He gets what he wants, because he goes and takes it. Well, don't you see that later on, why should he give that up? So if he sees that in the shop they've got what he wants, he can just break in at night and get it. If it's in somebody else's safe, right? Or it's somebody else's car, well, he just fucking take it. You see how his behavior should just carry on. So the delinquent child becomes such a disciple of the superior. He's so superior because he's used his will, and he becomes a disciple of the will, and that's all he knows. And so now you're dealing with a potentially criminal person who can never change. He can't work with other people. This thing worked for him, so he now becomes a criminal, gun-toting, knife-toting, smart aleck. He thinks he's smarter than everybody else, right, as well. That's why he can't give up crime, because he thinks at that moment when he's having the high, when he's breaking in and grabbing the money or whatever, he feels superior to everybody else because he had one up, and they'll be wondering who did it. And just for that temporary high, he's addicted to it. It's the same with the gambler. You can start accounting for a lot of delinquent people now. The gambler, just for that little win, you see, he believes that his will was behind the horse that won. See how it works? The will then takes on a life of its own. I will that horse to win. You know how they do it in the game? You see them going, come on, come on, come on, right? They don't even notice their own behavior, or at the dogs, the greyhound or they're all screaming for the horse to win. It's because in their mind, in an infantile way, they believe that they're actually pushing the horse to win. And if it does win, they're going, yeah, I won money. So the will starts to rule them rather than them ruling the will, so to speak. So you get all of this. And Adler beautifully showed the dangers and the positives. Now, in my work, I also showed some of the negatives, in the sense that how can nobody have noticed that your will is fighting the collective will? That's will rubbing up against will. Right? It's like bone rubbing up against bone, iron up against iron. There's no oil. Can't you see that over time, at a specific moment, there's going to be an apocalypse? Something's going to break, because this rule cannot go on forever, because there'll be a critical mass reached. And I believe we are reaching that critical mass. Everybody's individual will is bound to join the collective will. So the very collective will that you fought, your will adds to it. You eventually are adding to the collective will for another incoming soul to fight. You don't realize that people before you are the collective will, and that you will be the collective will, part of the collective will for the new ones coming in. Now, this is when I say that Freud started to notice this when he was young, when he was older. His last book, Civilization and Its Discontent, is a pessimistic reading, and I'm unpacking it here. Yeah, he was aware, I think something's wrong with this whole fucking problem. And he wasn't the only one. Schopenhauer himself just said, it's over. I have a fatalistic, pessimistic philosophy. Slam the door on reality, climb under the bed, just block it all out. It's temporary. And he's not the only one, right? There's many others. And looking around today, I mean, a clever person just goes, I don't see how this is going to work. The will is our means to becoming actualized, but the very will itself, in its other mode, is the source of our destruction. What can be done about it? And the answer is nobody knows. How could you know? Your will got you over those parental hurdles, right? Got you to fight with your siblings. Then it got to fight with the people in the streets, your friends. It got you to be somebody. What do you think sports is so important in school? Then to the next, then to the next, then to the next. And there's always a payoff, right? The feeling of superiority. Then your culture starts talking in terms of superiority and competition. It can do no other. And so your will slowly then blends with the collective will. So the will could Schopenhauer have been right that the will itself has organized this? No, he said it was all blind and there was no intelligence behind it. Well, that may be. But one way or the other, this collective will is becoming an egregore. It's becoming a thing of its own. And we are puppets on its string. We are its glove puppets, the will. So then you say, oh my goodness, would I be then right to go towards Buddhism? Now that I see this, you see, and all of these questions about the East arise. But how can a 5-year-old child make that decision?
No, they can't. They can't. No.
This is all lovely, highfalutin stuff when you're later in your life. The problem's already over, mate. You needed to become a superior type from the first gasp of breath, right? This thing is not so simple as to patch it up later on by going east. It's too late. You're born, even the Eastern person is born out of this will to exist, this will to live. So in short, this is Adler's, account of telos. That you are moved by necessity, to overcome. And this is how the will to power then becomes, what it is, so dominant in our lives.
And so the counterpoint of this is it has to sort of transmute at some stage into the will to meaning. And part of this is through a veneration of freedom. As you wrote in the article, you don't see any statues to freedom in modern society. You don't see statues towards conformity. Maybe I'll read the last little bit of this article, and we'll sort of wrap it up from there.
Yeah.
That sounds all right, Michael. Yeah, super. Yeah, so when we were speaking about the will a little bit, one of the people that understood this and are wanting to try to get away from this this will to meaning and the tension that arises as it sort of conflicts with the will to power that you've been describing so far, it was Herbert Marcuse. He lived from 1898 to 1979. Wherever he is, he's happy, you write. His spawn of hedonic squabbling brats continue to do his bidding. We now have insight into what Jung meant by individuation, as well as a deeper understanding about the nature of the will. Don't bash it, because had the will not initially acted to produce the primitive self, or id, humankind would never have been able to take the next vital step. We had to first exist on the level of the it, in order to value the other as thou, and return to self anew. We've gained insight into today's deplorable state of decay. We know what regression really pertains to. The deification of crowd consciousness also stands explained. The boss hogs supporting our immersion in the crowd themselves operate on the level of it. Consequently, there's no other way they can endow another as thou. Their attitude toward the outsider is, therefore, characteristically antagonistic. But let us not forget the absolute role of freedom. To honor freedom, we must not attempt to force an upgrade on anyone, no matter how primitive their actions and how affronted we are by it. To worship the freedom at the root of evil is your supreme duty and calling. Tend then that altar well, concern yourself with nothing else. And so we skipped a little bit of the article where we spoke about of seeing the other, another person as maybe a mirror of the self in a bit, and having this sense when we're not trying to crush the will of other people and we're venerating freedom, what you have to do is nurture the will then of others, nurture their will to meaning. Is that sort of how you see it then, Michael? Is this sort of some of the answers of what we've been speaking about so far?
Well, that's right, because these idealists had understood what we just mentioned about the critical mass being reached. And so they needed a radical change in terms of what the will is. So did Viktor Frankl, because they could see the pathocalypse that I spoke of coming. Will just cannot keep rubbing on will. So the transmutation to the will to meaning, will toward meaning, this would help. Right? This would stabilize things. The raw will to power is on a countdown to destruction. We don't see it because the individual is so caught up in having to use his will to survive for himself that he becomes a disciple of the will. But he's therefore not perceiving its negative aspect. Right? He's what Heidegger called thrown. He's confronted with facticity, and he learns that he has a tool to navigate through the facticity, which is the will of other people, and that's called the will. And he's going to use it. It's given to him to use. And stupid reactions like going east later on in your life and adopting these solipsistic theories of no will, that's all Schopenhauer could come up with in his life, is to become an ascetic. That's far too late in the day, and it's not going to work.
There is no self to have a will. This is at the essence of these Eastern philosophies,
Right.
exactly. And part of what you're saying with the will to power is this. You were objectified as a child by the parent, and so you objectify other people are just objects in this material world to manipulate with it. And that's why it's fine. That's why there's no such thing as morality, isn't it? It's just a battle of wills.
That's right.
Except, yeah.
And if you give that up, then according to the Adlerian scheme, well, according to all the different schemes, it's not going to work. Aristotle would say, how can you give up becoming? There's being and there's becoming. How can you give up telos? Then you're as dead as the things that you make. Is that what you want? Adler would say, then you're going to be a permanent inferior type. Passive, docile. How can you combat the collective will by just saying, well, I will not exercise my will? It's so unnatural to do that, right? Because the child, remember, is responding to something that is violating its own will. That's why it pushes back. How can you not do so? The life order doesn't allow you to be that passive. You'd be dead. You'd be an inferior type. And you can't choose that. Life won't allow you to choose it. So those are dead ends. They're not going to work. And as you say, you'd have to negate the very self and remain at the archaic animalistic level. And there'd be no freedom whatsoever. You'd never move up into the solar world. That's impossible. Even your biology does that, whether you like it or not. Yeah. So we are compelled to continue, right? But that doesn't mean that you then cannot proceed in a more philosophical way, right? In a more sophisticated way. And as we said, it wasn't answered whether or not you're pushed by the will from behind or there is still a transcendent self doing what is required. If you were to examine the pathological type, and we've already done that, one would be the inferior type who goes, I just sit on a bed of nails beside the river and I don't do anything. And then the other pathological type is your so-called progressive who's dynamited the tracks so that he doesn't have to, experience telos anymore. Now, we were warned about this type from people like Jean Baudrillard, the French philosopher, who warned it in a different way. But he said that if you surround yourself by all these plastic artificial objects, meaning those without telos, how can you remain a living organic being? All those dead hammers that we talked about in the previous, just go to your home base and there they all are, right? These generic things. We have produced them in such abundance and we live in amongst it. We're not part of nature. We don't go anywhere where there is the telos. We have these fucking plastic flowers and plastic daffodils and everything, right? So in the end, we ourselves end up as being beings that don't even have telos. Because we prefer this plastic artificial world of AI and everything else. And our AI is, in a warped way, our attempt to create something, like the organic computer, the robot that does have telos. All through these thousands of years, we've noticed this thing, as I keep insisting, that nature has the telos and we don't. Well, we envy that. And so our technology is the pathetic Frankensteinian, Dr. Frankensteinian methodology by which we want to give our creations telos. You see how it works? That's how computering came about. That's how the whole postmodern world came about. Now, it hasn't happened and it never will. But we have this warped Dr. Frankensteinian idea that we will give rise to robots or something that will have telos. Look how warped our minds are. So somebody like Freud would say, look, it doesn't matter if your society goes down because of will rubbing on will, Michael, like you said. Have you acknowledged the 20 other things that can destroy your society? Like this other one about postmodern man? He goes, don't be so niggardly as to think that the apocalypse is coming from one source. Oh my God, that's right, I say. There's me hunkering down and wanting to advocate for coming apocalypse. I forgot about the 20 others potential. What am I thinking? I'm trying to awaken people with my placards talking about the will rubbing on will. They can't even get their minds around that and wouldn't matter anyway because there's 20 other abominations that you don't even know about coming that can do the same trick. So why worry? Why lose sleep over something that may never happen? It's only theory that your philosophy that will rubbing on will one day lead. You don't know when. It could be 1,000 years from now. It could be 10,000. Why are you losing sleep over it? And you can't change it. any more than you can change those limits of the reason, right? When we said that there's limits to the reason, limits to what our mind's going to, are you going to find a way to extend that and change that? No, they've been trying for decades. Everything in technology is an attempt to do that. It's laughable. All they do is find out more things that the mind can't answer. They ended up with the quantum universe. They can't even tell if it's a particle or a wave. All the science has done is not crack the problem, but create more things that become a problem. More things that you can't answer with the human mind. So somebody listening to you ardently and it's going, yes, I'm glad we called you for this board meeting and we wanted to know what your thoughts on the future are, Michael. You've sketched this out really wonderfully. We've got all the pie charts. Okay, add it to the pile. And over in the corner, you see a palace of fucking filing cabinets full of apocalyptic nightmare scenarios, of which they just add your one to the top. Nice having you over to let us know there's a few more we can add to the pile. And you go, oh my God, I thought this was the B end and all end of everything that's, destructive. Oh, they go, no. We have a guy in here every weekend telling us about something else. The technology, there's no birthing anymore. There's all in vitro. We're not going to have sex anymore. We're going to have the headsets. Yeah. Hey, keep adding it on. Yeah. Thank you for bringing up, the one that is your hobby horse there, but we've got plenty more to worry about.
But sure, how's all this psychology going to fix climate change?
Right. They're talking about a comet, talking about an asteroid, and they're talking about climate change or another pandemic or China, death by China or death by another COVID or whatever.
Yeah.
And you just turn around and go, what the fuck? I'm talking about Alfred Adler and Sigmund Freud and man, I thought this was very, very important. And it is.
Certainly. It's the most
And it could
important
be the one
so.
that in the end, the pathocalypse could easily be the one that you nailed. So what? It's all over anyway. You can raise your glass of champagne at the end, go, I was right, bang, as it all disappears. Does anybody alive to remember what you said? Or that you cared enough? You see where we are, right? It's very, very strange the way things have been set up. And these tawdry go east remedies will soon be shown to be a total detour. A lot of people are falling for it, but it's not curing anything. It's becoming impassive. It's becoming inferior. It's like becoming regressive. Yes, if you turn off your mind and you turn off your libido and you turn off your sexuality and you turn everything off, you can call that a remedy if you want. It's not a very fucking smart one.
Definitely not. Yeah.
Because all you're doing is turning yourself into a dead hammer or a screwdriver. We already make enough dead things. Remember, the human being, everything he creates, including computers, has no telos. So now you're going to turn yourself. Now you work on yourself so that you become like that, artificial. You become the simulation, the simulacra.
But if I can become dead inside, then I don't have to feel that inner rage.
You feel
you know
nothing.
what I mean? That's it. I feel nothing. Crushed by will. I have no will. Yeah, there is no me.
Then you want to create a monastery, and then you want to create a world full of these duplicates and say we've solved it. But what I'm trying to say in a humorous way there, in the last couple of minutes, is you may do that. And by the way, a lot of these people really do want this. And if you get that, the disaster will come in another way yet again. Just when you think you fixed it in these communal, World Health Economic Forum methodologies, you may think that you've created this perfect utopia. And yet, one little prick of the balloon, and bang, you're done anyway. It'll come out, it'll seep out in a way that you won't even imagine. There's been movies that have whistle-blown this.
Yeah. Well, that's us near the 2 hour mark again there. So
Okay.
I guess we'll wrap it up from there. But yeah, this is us, our first episode then of 2026. I'm sure it'll be an interesting year to reflect back upon. Who knows what's in store, but it's the mystery of it that keeps it interesting. Yeah.
Big thanks for reading that. And that's a great summary. And our first one of the new year. So
yeah. I'm sure people have enjoyed it. I really hope they have. And thank you so much again, Michael. This has been a fantastic podcast with it. And thank you for your help over the last few months, especially with starting a new channel. And thank you to everybody stopping by and watching. Thank you for everybody that's leaving, likes and comments and sharing. Again, they're massively important to starting a new project with it. And yeah, well, best of luck, everybody, for 2026. And thank you once more, Michael. I really do appreciate it. Yeah.